The night had fallen heavy over Edinburgh, and the streets of the old city seemed to breathe with 1,000 stories. In the distance, Edinburgh Castle stood like an ancient sentinel, its towering walls etched against the moonlight, its spires reaching up to a dark sky. The wind howled through the narrow, winding alleys of the Royal Mile, carrying with it whispers of a time long past. For centuries, this castle had stood as a symbol of Scotland's strength, its royal lineage, and its turbulent history. But deep within its stone walls, there was a secret that even the bravest dared not uncover, a haunting that had plagued the castle for generations. The story began in the 16th century, when King James VI of Scotland resided in the mighty fortress. The king, though powerful, had enemies, both within his court and beyond. And it was these enemies, some say, who first brought forth the curse that would never leave the castle. There was talk of dark rituals, forbidden pacts, and shadowy figures slipping through the castle at night. The royal family, it was whispered, had not been untouched by the supernatural, and strange occurrences had begun to plague them. But the most terrifying of all was the legend of the Phantom Lady, a spirit said to haunt the castle, her figure draped in a flowing gown, her face hidden beneath a veil. Her footsteps could be heard echoing through the corridors, though no one was ever seen. The servants spoke in hushed tones of the cold, clammy air that seemed to follow her, and the cold gusts of wind that would sweep through rooms without warning. Some believed she was the ghost of a long-forgotten queen, cursed to wander the halls of the castle for eternity. The king had just returned from a tense meeting with his council, and the halls were filled with whispers of betrayal. James had received news that his enemies within the court were plotting against him, and the weight of this threat seemed to press down on the very stones of the castle. It was late in the evening when Lady Margaret, a noblewoman who had recently arrived at court, found herself drawn to the castle's uppermost chambers. The air was thick with the scent of damp stone, and as she made her way through the labyrinthine corridors, she felt a strange sense of being watched. The castle seemed to grow darker as she ascended the winding staircase, and her heartbeat quickened in response. She could have sworn she heard soft footsteps behind her, though when she turned, no one was there. Her curiosity led her deeper into the castle's bowels, where few dared to venture. She passed the great hall and entered a smaller chamber that overlooked the vast city below. The windows were fogged with the chill of the night, and the shadows in the room seemed to twist in strange, unnatural shapes. But it was what she saw next that made her blood run cold. There, in the corner of the room, stood the Phantom Lady. Her veil was lifted just enough to reveal eyes that glowed with an otherworldly light, and her body seemed to shimmer in the dim light of the chamber. Her presence filled the room, a chilling reminder of the curse that had settled over the castle. Lady Margaret's breath caught in her throat as she tried to back away, but the phantom's gaze seemed to hold her in place. She tried to speak, but no words came out, only the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. The Phantom Lady raised a hand, a gesture both elegant and haunting. She beckoned Margaret forward, her mouth moving as though speaking a language from another age. Lady Margaret was frozen, torn between terror and an inexplicable urge to obey. The room around her seemed to close in, and the air grew colder still, the walls almost alive with the whispers of the long dead. Suddenly, the door behind Margaret slammed shut, and she spun around, her heart racing. But when she looked back at the phantom, she found the room empty. The chill of the air lingered, but the specter had vanished, leaving only a faint echo of her presence behind. Lady Margaret, her mind reeling, fled from the chamber, her footsteps ringing out as she rushed back down the staircase. But as she passed the castle's central courtyard, she heard a voice, a whisper that seemed to come from the very stone itself. "Beware the stone, Lady Margaret. Beware what lies beneath." Lady Margaret's breath caught in her throat as she tried to back away, but the phantom's gaze seemed to hold her in place. She tried to speak, but no words came out, only the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. The Phantom Lady raised a hand, a gesture both elegant and haunting. She beckoned Margaret forward, her mouth moving as though speaking a language from another age. Lady Margaret was frozen, torn between terror and an inexplicable urge to obey. The room around her seemed to close in, and the air grew colder still, the walls almost alive with the whispers of the long dead. The flickering candlelight seemed to cast even more shadows, the shadows deepening, growing longer, reaching toward her, pulling her toward the phantom. Suddenly, the door behind Margaret slammed shut, and she spun around, her heart racing. But when she looked back at the phantom, she found the room empty. The chill of the air lingered, but the specter had vanished, leaving only a faint echo of her presence behind. Lady Margaret, her mind reeling, fled from the chamber, her footsteps ringing out as she rushed back down the staircase. Her heart was still racing, and her breath came in ragged gasps. The fear that had gripped her seemed to burn away as she made her way toward the central courtyard. But something deep inside her told her that the castle would never release her from its grip. The haunting would continue, always watching, always waiting. As she passed the castle's central courtyard, she heard a voice, a whisper that seemed to come from the very stone itself. "Beware the stone, Lady Margaret. Beware what lies beneath." The words echoed in her mind, each syllable seeping deeper into her consciousness. She stumbled to a halt, her body frozen in place as the whispers filled her ears. The stones beneath her feet felt cold and unforgiving, as though they were drawing her back to the depths of the castle. Her heart skipped a beat as the truth began to dawn upon her. The castle's curse was not just a tale. It was real, and it had chosen her. Lady Margaret's legs trembled as the sound of the voice reverberated through the courtyard. She knew she had to leave, she had to escape. But no matter how fast she walked, the walls of the castle seemed to close in, and the whispers followed her like a shadow. The stones beneath her feet seemed to shift with every step, and the once still air was now filled with an ominous chill. The night had fallen deeper, the darkness heavier, and the echoes of the past seemed to be calling her back. She glanced over her shoulder one last time, her mind struggling to comprehend the terror that had gripped her. The voice, though faint, whispered again, this time clearer. "You cannot escape, Lady Margaret. The curse of the castle has already claimed you." Margaret froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew with a sudden clarity that she had unwittingly become a part of the castle's endless cursed history. There would be no escape. She would walk its haunted halls, just as the Phantom Lady had, for all eternity. Her fate, it seemed, was sealed. With a rush of fear, Lady Margaret quickened her pace, nearly running now. She passed through the castle gates, emerging into the open air. But the whispers still followed her, carried by the wind. The city beyond seemed distant and unfamiliar. In her mind, only the cold stone of Edinburgh Castle remained. The curse would never release its grip on her. It was as though the very ground beneath her feet had been marked, and no matter where she went, she would always return to this place, to these haunted halls. Lady Margaret stumbled into the castle courtyard, the whispers still echoing in her mind. The night felt colder now, the moon dim behind a veil of clouds. The once majestic stone walls of Edinburgh Castle, now a tomb of forgotten souls, loomed overhead, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch like fingers across the ground. She could feel the weight of the curse pressing on her chest, each breath harder than the last, as if the castle itself was drawing her in. It wasn't just the whispers. There was something more, something ancient that had awoken within the stone itself. She walked through the courtyard, feeling a strange compulsion to return to the castle's heart. The voices in her head grew louder, murmuring secrets and warnings from the past. Every step seemed to draw her deeper into the ancient stone, as if the castle was alive, aware of her presence. Her pulse quickened. She tried to resist, tried to turn away, but the pull was too strong. It was as though she had already crossed a threshold that could never be undone. She found herself at the foot of the castle's towering spires, the grand entrance in front of her. The door, once regal and proud, now hung crookedly, as if struggling to remain upright. The cold wind howled through the gaps in the walls, carrying with it the smell of old stone and decay. She hesitated, standing at the threshold, her hand on the cold iron of the door handle. Something, perhaps a final shred of sanity, told her not to go inside. But as the wind picked up, it seemed to whisper her name. "Margaret, come closer." With a deep breath, Lady Margaret pushed the door open, the creaking sound echoing through the halls. The interior was dark, only faint beams of moonlight filtering through the narrow windows. Dust hung in the air, thick and heavy, and the floors creaked under her weight. As she stepped into the grand hall, a shiver ran down her spine. The place was eerily silent, yet she felt the presence of something watching her. Every corner of the castle seemed to whisper her name. Every wall seemed to breathe with a life of its own. The deeper she ventured, the more she felt herself sinking into the castle's grip. The walls seemed to pulse, and the air grew colder with each step. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind slammed the door shut behind her, trapping her inside. Lady Margaret spun around, her heart pounding. She was no longer alone. The presence in the room was palpable, thick like smoke, pressing in on her from all sides. Her breath quickened as she turned in search of an escape, but there was no way out. The castle had claimed her. From the shadows, a figure appeared. It was not the Phantom Lady, but a tall, dark figure, his features hidden in the dim light. He stood still, as if watching her. His presence sent a cold shiver down her spine. She opened her mouth to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, and as he came closer, his eyes gleamed with an unnatural light. "Who are you?" Lady Margaret finally managed to whisper, her voice trembling. The figure didn't respond at first. Then, with a voice as cold as the stone around them, he spoke. "I am a part of this place. I am bound to it, just as you now are." His voice reverberated through the hall, and for a moment, it seemed as if the entire castle had spoken with him. Lady Margaret's heart raced. The truth was dawning on her. The castle was not just haunted by spirits, it was alive, and it had chosen her as its new prisoner. Suddenly, the figure reached out and touched her arm. The moment his hand made contact, an icy chill spread through her entire body. Her vision blurred, and she felt a wave of dizziness crash over her. The walls seemed to close in further, and she could hear the whispers again. Louder, more frantic. She tried to pull away, but her body refused to obey. She was trapped, not just in the castle, but in its cursed grip, bound by forces she couldn't understand. The figure's grip tightened, and Lady Margaret felt herself being drawn into the very stone of the castle. The whispers now became deafening, a cacophony of voices from centuries past. She couldn't escape. The castle's curse had taken hold of her, and she knew deep down that it would never let her go. She was no longer just a visitor in the castle. She was a part of its dark history, just another lost soul doomed to wander its haunted halls forever. Lady Margaret's mind raced, but her body was frozen. The figure's grip, icy and relentless, began to pull her deeper into the stone. The whispers around her grew louder, their words unintelligible, like a chorus of lost souls crying for release. She fought to move, but the curse had taken full hold. The stone walls seemed to pulse with energy, and she felt as if she were sinking into the very earth beneath her feet. Her pulse quickened, her breath shallow, and she feared that she was being consumed by the castle itself. With a desperate effort, Lady Margaret pulled herself away from the figure's touch. She stumbled back, her hands pressed against the cold stone wall for support. The castle seemed to come alive around her. Every creak, every gust of wind felt like a warning, a call to stay in the shadows. But she could no longer ignore it. The curse was real. She could feel its presence in every crack of the castle, in the dust that clung to the air, in the very stones beneath her feet. But the castle would not let her leave so easily. The temperature dropped further, the chill now biting into her very soul. A gust of wind blew through the corridor, and with it came a soft, ghostly laughter, echoing from the farthest reaches of the castle. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest. She knew she wasn't alone. There were other forces at work here, forces that had been trapped in this place for centuries, waiting for someone like her to enter. She was no longer a mere visitor in Edinburgh Castle. She was a part of its cursed history, just as the Phantom Lady had been. Suddenly, the shadows shifted, and from the darkness a figure emerged. A tall, cloaked woman, her face hidden behind a veil. The Phantom Lady. Lady Margaret's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the figure from the whispers of the servants. The ghost was here, and it was not a mere story. The Phantom Lady stepped forward, her footsteps light but deliberate. Her presence filled the room, her cold aura sinking into Margaret's bones. "Why do you come here?" Lady Margaret finally managed to ask, her voice shaky but defiant. The Phantom Lady did not answer immediately. She simply stood before Margaret, her presence almost suffocating. The woman raised her hand, motioning to the walls of the castle, as though they were a part of her. "You are not the first to seek answers here," she whispered. Her voice was soft but carried a weight of sorrow, a timeless grief that seemed to echo through the ages. Margaret's heart raced as she absorbed the words. The Phantom Lady was more than just a spirit. She was a messenger of something far greater, something that had haunted this castle for generations. The figure raised her veil slightly, revealing eyes that glowed with an unnatural light. Eyes that seemed to see right through Margaret, into the very depths of her soul. The Phantom Lady stepped closer, her chilling breath cold against Margaret's skin. "You cannot escape this place," the Phantom Lady whispered, her voice barely a breath. "The curse has claimed you, as it has claimed all those before you. You are now a part of its dark history. The stone cannot be undone." Her words reverberated in Margaret's mind, and for a moment, it felt as though the castle itself had spoken. The Phantom Lady's voice was the voice of the castle, the voice of all the lost souls trapped within its walls. In that moment, Lady Margaret felt a strange calm wash over her. The terror was still there, but it was now mixed with a deeper understanding. The castle wasn't just haunted, it was alive, and it was waiting for her. The Phantom Lady stepped back, vanishing into the shadows, leaving Margaret standing alone in the dark corridor, her mind reeling. The castle had taken hold of her, and she was now its prisoner. Lady Margaret stumbled backward, her heart racing, but she couldn't escape. The whispers returned, louder now, surrounding her, suffocating her. The walls of the castle seemed to shift, their ancient stones creaking under pressure. She tried to move, but it was as if the very castle was holding her in place, unwilling to let her go. The curse had taken its grip, and there was no turning back now. She was part of its story, part of its dark, eternal history. The next moments passed in a blur. The whispers, the cold, the heavy atmosphere, it all blended together. Lady Margaret knew, deep in her bones, that she had stepped into something ancient, something that could not be undone. The Phantom Lady was just one part of the castle's torment, and now she too would be trapped, a lost soul in the haunted halls. The only question that remained was whether she would ever leave, alive or dead. The castle's heavy doors creaked as Lady Margaret stumbled down the narrow hallway, her senses reeling from the encounter with the Phantom Lady. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the very stones of the castle were pressing against her, pushing her deeper into the labyrinth of corridors. She had to find a way out. Every step she took seemed to echo, the sound bouncing off the cold stone walls, growing louder with each passing moment. Her heart raced, and a cold sweat formed on her brow. Something was watching her, something more than just the whispers of the past. As she moved deeper into the castle, Margaret noticed that the sounds around her seemed to change. The whispers from the shadows had quieted, but the air felt even heavier now, almost oppressive. A sudden chill filled the space, more intense than before. It was as though the castle itself had come alive, watching her every move. She reached a wooden door, its edges worn and faded with age. The door seemed almost out of place, hidden away behind a tapestry that had been partially torn. This was no ordinary door. It seemed to beckon her, as if it held the answers she had been desperately seeking. Margaret hesitated. She had already seen too much, felt the presence of something far older than herself in this castle. But her curiosity, her need to uncover the truth, drove her forward. She reached for the door, the cold metal handle sending a shiver through her fingers. As she turned the handle, the door groaned open, revealing a dimly lit chamber beyond. The room was small, with high ceilings and walls lined with ancient bookshelves, but it was not the books that caught Margaret's attention. In the center of the room stood a large stone pedestal covered in dust and cobwebs. Upon it was a single, glowing object, a golden key. The key seemed to pulse with energy, a golden glow that illuminated the entire room. Margaret stepped forward, her breath caught in her throat. She could feel the power emanating from it, a force unlike anything she had ever experienced. It was as though the key was calling to her, urging her to take it, to use it. But she knew better than to act without caution. The castle had already shown her the cost of unbridled curiosity. Still, the key seemed to promise something, an escape, a way to break the curse, or perhaps the secret to the Phantom Lady's eternal torment. She reached for the key, her fingers trembling as she wrapped them around its cool surface. The moment her hand made contact, a jolt of energy shot through her body, and the room seemed to shift. The walls of the chamber groaned, and the floor beneath her feet cracked with a deep, resonant sound. Margaret gasped and staggered backward, her heart pounding in her chest. The golden key had triggered something ancient that had been lying dormant within the castle for centuries. The ground beneath Margaret's feet shifted again, and suddenly, the stone floor before her cracked wide open. A staircase, hidden for centuries, began to emerge from the floor. The stairwell was dark, winding down into the depths of the castle, beyond where the light could reach. Margaret stared down into the abyss, her pulse quickening. She had no choice now. Whatever the key had unlocked, it was leading her into the heart of the castle's dark past. She hesitated, her breath shallow as she peered into the dark, but her resolve hardened. She couldn't turn back now. Stepping cautiously onto the stairs, she descended into the depths of the castle. The further she went, the colder it became, the air thick with the scent of decay and age. As she reached the bottom, the dim light of the key in her hand revealed a vast chamber. It was unlike any she had seen before, its walls lined with ancient runes, its floor covered in centuries-old dust. At the center of the room stood an altar, and atop it was a strange carved stone. A deep sense of dread filled her chest as she realized what she was standing in, the heart of the curse. Margaret approached the altar, her steps slow and deliberate, the golden key still gripped tightly in her hand. As she reached the stone, she placed the key upon it, and the moment it made contact, the room seemed to come alive. The runes on the walls began to glow, their light flickering and dancing in time with her heartbeat. A low, rumbling sound filled the room, and Margaret could hear the faint whisper of voices, ancient and long forgotten. The stone began to glow as well, revealing an inscription that had been hidden for centuries. The inscription, though in a language she didn't understand, seemed to speak directly to her. It was as if the very stone was alive, whispering its secrets to her mind. The whispers grew louder, and Margaret could feel the weight of the curse pressing down on her. as if the very air around her was charged with ancient power. She had unlocked something that had been sealed away for a reason. The Phantom Lady's curse was no mere story. It was real. And now, Margaret was the one who had brought it back to life. Margaret's pulse quickened as the temperature in the chamber dropped further. The shadows around her seemed to move on their own, twisting and shifting with a life of their own. The stone walls of the room groaned, their ancient surface creaking under some unseen pressure. Her breath became shallow, misting in the cold air as the footsteps grew louder, unmistakably close now. They weren't just echoes, they were real. They were coming from somewhere deep within the castle. Desperation set in. Lady Margaret looked around for a way to escape, but the room seemed to close in around her. The doorway through which she had entered had disappeared, swallowed by the very stone of the castle. Her mind raced. She had been led into a trap, and now she was at its mercy. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. She could only face the inevitable. Her eyes darted to the pedestal where the golden key lay, glowing faintly in the dim light. The key had led her here, had awakened something ancient and cursed. As she looked at the key, she remembered the warning she had heard. The voice from the stone. Beware the stone, Lady Margaret. Beware what lies beneath. The footsteps were now unmistakably clear. Margaret could hear them. Heavy, deliberate, like the steps of something far larger than a man. Her heart pounded in her chest as the sound drew closer and closer. A dark figure emerged from the shadows at the far end of the chamber, tall and imposing. It was cloaked in darkness, its features indistinguishable, but there was no mistaking the malevolent presence that filled the room. Margaret's breath caught in her throat as the figure stepped into the dim light. Its form was human in shape, but contorted, twisted by age and malice. The figure raised its hand, revealing fingers long and skeletal, and as it moved toward her, the ground beneath Margaret's feet seemed to tremble. It was the spirit of the Phantom Lady, but now she was not the ethereal figure Margaret had once seen. This was something more terrifying, something far older, more powerful, and more vengeful. The Phantom Lady's voice filled the room, soft and mournful, yet laced with a deep bitterness. You should never have come here, Lady Margaret. The curse has claimed you, just as it claimed all who entered this chamber before you. Her voice echoed off the walls, filling the room with an unnatural resonance. As she spoke, the walls seemed to pulse with a dark energy, and the very air vibrated with the weight of her words. Margaret stumbled back, her eyes wide with fear. The curse, the same curse that had haunted the castle for centuries, was now closing in on her. She could feel it wrapping around her like an invisible noose, tightening with every passing second. Lady Margaret's mind raced. What had she awakened? What had she unleashed by touching the key? The truth was dawning on her. The key wasn't just a way to unlock a room. It was a part of the castle's dark history. A key that had been sealed away for a reason. And now that reason was coming for her. With a sudden surge of strength, Margaret rushed forward, hoping to grab the golden key from the pedestal. But as she reached for it, a cold hand shot out, gripping her wrist in an iron-tight grasp. The Phantom Lady's face was inches from hers, her eyes glowing with an unearthly light. The room seemed to spin, and Margaret's vision blurred as the world around her dissolved into shadows. She felt herself being dragged back, her feet leaving the ground as though pulled by some unseen force. Her body went limp, and for a moment she thought she would lose consciousness. But she couldn't let herself go. She couldn't give in to the curse. She had to fight. In the midst of the chaos, Margaret's mind cleared. She remembered the stone altar, the inscription that had glowed when she placed the key upon it. She remembered the voice, the warning. Beware what lies beneath. Beneath. The thought struck her like a bolt of lightning. The key had not just opened a door, it had unlocked something buried deep beneath the castle itself. Something that had been hidden away for a reason. With newfound determination, Margaret wrenched herself free from the grasp of the Phantom Lady and sprinted toward the altar. She could hear the Phantom Lady's laughter behind her, cruel and mocking. But she didn't stop. She had to finish what she had started. Margaret reached the altar and, without thinking, slammed the golden key into the carved stone. The room shook violently, and the ground beneath her feet cracked open. A torrent of dark energy exploded from the altar, filling the chamber with blinding light. The curse was being broken, or perhaps it was being transformed into something far worse. As the energy from the altar swirled around her, Margaret felt herself being lifted off the ground, her body suspended in the air. The Phantom Lady screamed, her voice distorted by the power being unleashed. The room filled with a deafening roar as the curse broke free, unraveling in a wave of supernatural force. Margaret's vision went white. And then, for a moment, everything was still. When the light faded and the roar of the curse subsided, the chamber was silent once more. Margaret collapsed to the floor, her body trembling with exhaustion. The golden key lay on the altar, now dim and lifeless. But the air was still thick with an otherworldly presence, a lingering reminder of the curse that had once gripped the castle. Margaret knew this was only the beginning. Whatever had been unleashed, whatever had been awakened by the key, was still out there, and it was coming for her. The room seemed to shift as Margaret stepped further into the chamber. The green light that bathed the space was unnatural, almost sickly, pulsating with an energy that felt ancient and malevolent. She took a deep breath, her senses overwhelmed by the stench of damp stone and something older, something foul that clung to the air. At the center of the room was the altar, its dark surface covered in thick dust. Margaret hesitated for only a moment before approaching it. The object upon it was hidden beneath a cloth, but even so, she could feel the weight of its presence, heavy, dark, like an anchor pulling at her very soul. She could hear her heartbeat, loud in her ears, as she slowly reached out with trembling fingers, lifting the cloth. The cloth fell away, revealing the object, a blackened, twisted relic, so old it seemed to be fused with the stone of the altar itself. It was neither human nor animal, but something between, something neither living nor truly dead. The object pulsed with an unnatural energy, and as Margaret's fingers brushed it, a surge of cold shot through her body. A vision flashed before her eyes, quick and violent. Flashes of shadowy figures, a king's bloodied hands, whispers of a betrayal so dark it seemed to tear the very fabric of reality itself. She stumbled back, the vision fading as quickly as it had appeared, but the remnants of the cold still gripped her. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she turned toward the door. She knew now that she could not leave without confronting whatever this object was, whatever curse had been bound to it. But how? Margaret's thoughts raced as she backed away from the altar, her eyes still locked on the object. She couldn't shake the feeling that whatever she had just seen was a warning, a glimpse into something far worse than she had anticipated. The curse wasn't just a part of the castle's history. It was alive, its power feeding off the fear that had plagued the royal family for generations. Her mind went back to the stories she had heard upon first arriving in Edinburgh, of a betrayal that had stained the castle's walls in blood, a betrayal that had torn apart not just a king, but a kingdom. Had this object been the source of that darkness? Was it this relic that had cursed the castle, its ghosts, its rulers? The wind howled louder, as if responding to her inner turmoil. It rattled the windows of the chamber, its shrill cry seeming to mock her confusion. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch further, almost alive with a malevolent hunger. Margaret turned toward the door, a desperate need to escape filling her every fiber. But as she reached the threshold, she froze. Standing in the doorway, as though it had materialized from the very shadows, was the figure she had seen in the hall, the one that had haunted her since her arrival. Its eyes glowed with an unsettling light, and it moved with a fluid grace that defied the laws of reality. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest, her breath shallow as the figure stepped closer. "Do you see now, Margaret?" The figure spoke, its voice low, almost a whisper, but somehow carrying the weight of centuries. "The curse has always been here. It has never left." Margaret's pulse quickened, and her hand instinctively reached for the dagger she had hidden beneath her cloak. Her mind screamed at her to flee, but her legs felt like lead, rooted to the floor by the weight of the figure's presence. The figure took another step forward, and Margaret's grip on her dagger tightened. "You cannot fight what you do not understand," the figure continued, its voice still a low murmur that seemed to reverberate through the stone. "This castle, this land, all of it is bound to the curse. You have seen it with your own eyes now. It will never release its hold. Not on you, not on anyone." Margaret tried to steady her breath, her eyes narrowing as she gripped the hilt of the dagger. "I will stop it," she said, her voice trembling but defiant. The figure's lips twisted into a smirk. "You cannot stop what was never meant to be stopped. It is already too late." Margaret's breath caught as the figure raised its hand, and the shadows in the room seemed to respond, stretching toward her like fingers hungry for her soul. The temperature plummeted, and for a moment, Margaret could barely move, her body frozen by an unseen force. But as quickly as it had come, the pressure lifted. The figure stepped back, its mocking smile still playing at the edges of its lips. "You cannot fight what has been fated," it whispered. "The curse is your fate." "Margaret." The figure turned, its form dissolving into the shadows, vanishing as if it had never existed. The room was still again, but the chill lingered, the echoes of the figure's words reverberating through Margaret's mind. She was left alone, her heart racing, her mind reeling. The curse had spoken, and it had claimed her. But she couldn't let it win, not like this. Margaret stood there for a long moment, the silence overwhelming. The air around her was thick with the lingering presence of the curse. Slowly, she forced herself to move, stepping away from the altar and toward the door. The whispers were gone, replaced by an unsettling silence. But Margaret knew that she had only just begun to understand the depth of the darkness that clung to this castle. There were more answers to find, and perhaps more dangers to face. As she exited the chamber and moved back into the dark hallways, the weight of the curse seemed to press upon her. She wasn't sure what to do next, but one thing was certain: the castle's secrets were far from being revealed. Margaret's footsteps echoed through the long, deserted corridor, her mind racing with the haunting image of the shadowy figure. The oppressive silence that followed the figure's departure made her feel like she was being suffocated by the very walls of the castle. Each step she took seemed heavier than the last, as though the weight of centuries of bloodshed and curses was being pressed upon her. Her fingers clenched around the hilt of the dagger as she moved deeper into the winding hallways, the stone walls closing in. The light from her lantern flickered, casting long shadows that danced eerily across the walls. She had to find answers. The cursed relic, the phantom figure. the whispers of betrayal. Everything pointed to a hidden truth, something that had been buried beneath layers of history and fear. As she continued down the hallway, a cold breeze suddenly swept through the corridor, carrying with it a faint whisper. Margaret stopped in her tracks, her heart pounding in her chest. The whisper was too faint to make out, but it was undeniably there. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, like the very stones of the castle were speaking to her. "Margaret." The whisper came again, clearer this time, but distorted by an unnatural echo. She turned toward the sound, her eyes searching the shadows, but there was nothing. Only the eerie stillness of the castle. The cold wind seemed to grow colder still, as if it was warning her to stop, to turn back. But Margaret couldn't. Not now. She was too close. With a deep breath, Margaret continued forward, her determination stronger than ever. As she reached the end of the corridor, she saw a small wooden door, barely visible in the dark. It stood slightly ajar, a thin strip of pale light escaping through the crack. The door seemed to beckon her, as though it were waiting for her to find it. Margaret approached cautiously, her heart racing with both fear and anticipation. She could feel the temperature drop even further, the air thick with a presence that made her skin crawl. Slowly, she pushed the door open. The room beyond was dim, illuminated only by the flickering light from the lantern. The walls were lined with dusty old tapestries, their colors faded with age. At the far end of the room stood a large, ornate mirror, its surface covered in layers of grime. As Margaret stepped inside, she felt an unsettling presence in the room, a force that seemed to pulse from the mirror itself. She knew, without a doubt, that whatever had been haunting this castle was tied to it. As Margaret stepped closer to the mirror, she could see her reflection, but something was wrong. The face staring back at her was distorted, the features twisting unnaturally, as though the mirror was warping reality itself. For a moment, she thought she saw something move behind her reflection, something shadowy and dark. Her breath caught in her throat, and she took a step back. But the reflection did not follow. It remained, frozen in place, its eyes locked onto hers, with a look of cold, malevolent intent. Margaret could feel her heart racing as the shadows behind the mirror seemed to deepen, swirling with an energy that threatened to consume her. "Look into the past," a voice whispered, echoing from the depths of the mirror, "and you will see the truth." The voice, cold and distant, seemed to pull Margaret closer to the mirror, as if it was commanding her to look deeper, to uncover whatever hidden truth lay within. She reached out with trembling hands, her fingers brushing against the glass. It was icy cold, and as her skin touched it, a shock of pain shot through her arm. The mirror began to ripple, as if the glass itself was no longer solid, but a thin veil between this world and another. In an instant, Margaret found herself falling forward, her body moving as though drawn by an invisible force. She tried to resist, but the power of the mirror was too strong. Her feet left the ground, and she was pulled into the glass, her body passing through it like water. Suddenly, Margaret was no longer in the room. She found herself standing in a dark, mist-filled landscape. The air was thick with fog, and the ground beneath her feet was slick and uneven. The castle was nowhere to be seen, replaced by a desolate, barren landscape that stretched for miles in every direction. In the distance, she could make out a figure, a shadowy shape moving through the mist. It was a man, tall and cloaked, with a presence that exuded power and menace. As he approached, Margaret could feel the weight of his gaze, as though he were looking straight into her soul. His eyes glowed with an eerie, unnatural light. "Do you understand now?" The figure spoke, his voice carrying across the vast emptiness. "This is your fate, Margaret. The curse that binds this land, the bloodshed, the betrayal. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest as the figure drew closer. She felt paralyzed, unable to move, as though the very air had become too heavy for her to breathe. The figure raised a hand, and the ground beneath Margaret's feet began to tremble. "Nothing escapes the curse," the figure whispered. "Not even you." With a flick of his wrist, the world around her began to distort. The mist thickened, the ground cracked open, and Margaret felt herself falling once again, deeper into the abyss. Margaret woke with a start, gasping for air. She was back in the room with the mirror, her hands gripping the stone floor. The cold glass was still before her, no longer rippling, but the chill that filled her body remained. She struggled to her feet, disoriented and shaken, the echoes of the figure's words still ringing in her ears. The curse, the figure, the bloodshed, it was all connected. Margaret could no longer deny it. She had been given a glimpse into the very heart of the castle's dark history, and now she understood that her quest was far from over. Margaret stood before the mirror, her reflection now still and calm. Her heart still raced, but her resolve had solidified. The curse had marked her, but she would not let it win. She would uncover the secrets of this castle, no matter the cost. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with darkness and danger. But Margaret was ready to face it. She had no other choice. With one last glance at the mirror, Margaret turned and walked toward the door. The weight of the curse still hung heavily in the air, but she was no longer afraid. She had come to terms with what she had seen and knew what had to be done. She stepped out into the hallway, ready to confront the darkness head on. Margaret strode down the winding hallways, her heart still racing from the events she had just witnessed in the mirror. The air felt heavier now, each step echoing in the silence of the ancient castle. The cursed relic, the phantom figure, the whispers, they all pointed to one thing, the final confrontation. Her fingers tightened around the hilt of the dagger, her mind consumed by the truth she had uncovered. The curse was real, and it had to end here, at the heart of this cursed castle, where it had all begun. As Margaret approached the heart of the castle, a sudden chill swept through the hallway. Her breath hitched as she realized she was not alone. The shadows seemed to shift, swirling around her, and a voice, soft and ominous, whispered her name. "Margaret," it said, low and drawn, like a distant memory. Her gaze flickered to the shadows. The figure she had seen before, the cloaked one, was there, emerging from the darkness like a wraith. His glowing eyes pierced the gloom, his silhouette stark against the faint glow of the torches lining the walls. "You're too late," the figure said, his voice like a snake's hiss. "The curse is woven into the very stone. There is no escaping it. You cannot change fate." Margaret's grip on her dagger tightened, her eyes narrowing. "I don't believe in fate," she replied, her voice steady but filled with fire. "I believe in choice, and I choose to end this." With a sudden movement, the figure lunged, his arms outstretched. But Margaret was faster. She sidestepped, ducking into the shadows and disappearing from his view. The figure cursed, his eyes burning with fury as he searched for her. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest as she hid in the shadows, her breath shallow. She knew the figure was close. She could feel his presence, the oppressive weight of his power. This was the moment she had been preparing for, the moment that would either break her or set her free. Her mind raced as she searched the room for anything she could use to her advantage. The walls were lined with ancient tapestries, their intricate designs faded by time. She spotted a large ceremonial sword resting on a pedestal in the corner of the room. It was time to end this. With lightning speed, Margaret dashed across the room, grabbing the sword and lifting it with both hands. The weight of it was reassuring, its edge sharp and gleaming in the dim light. She turned to face the figure, her breath steady despite the fear threatening to choke her. "You are wrong," Margaret said, her voice ringing clear. "I am not afraid." The figure laughed, a sound that echoed through the room like the rattle of bones. "You should be," he sneered. "You're just a mortal, and I am the curse that has haunted this place for centuries." The figure's form shimmered and flickered like smoke, his true shape constantly shifting. With a wave of his hand, the shadows seemed to come alive, twisting and writhing around Margaret, trying to trap her, to pull her into the dark abyss. But Margaret was ready. She swung the sword with all her strength, cutting through the darkness as though it were nothing more than mist. "Be gone," she shouted, the words like a spell. "Your reign ends now." The figure screamed, his form flickering wildly before him. "No," he bellowed, "you cannot defeat me." But it was too late. Margaret's sword cleaved through the air, striking the figure with a brilliant flash of light. The shadows writhed and shrieked as they dissipated into nothingness, leaving only a hollow silence in their wake. The figure's form melted away, his body disintegrating into dust as the curse that had plagued the castle for centuries finally lifted. Margaret stood there, breathing heavily, the sword still clutched tightly in her hands. Margaret looked around the room, the weight of the castle's history finally lifting. The oppressive presence that had filled the air for so long was gone, replaced by an eerie peace. The curse had been broken, and the castle was free at last. As Margaret turned to leave, a soft voice echoed in her mind, one that had been silenced for centuries. "Thank you, Margaret," the voice whispered. "You have freed us all." She smiled faintly. The battle was won, but the journey was just beginning. As Margaret stepped out of the castle and into the fresh night air, she took a deep breath. The weight of the past was gone, and the future stretched before her, full of new possibilities. She had faced the darkness, and now she was free. But as she walked away from the castle, a soft whisper echoed on the wind. "The story is never truly over, Margaret." She turned but saw nothing, only the silhouette of the castle against the night sky. Closing screen. And so, this story comes to an end. But remember, every ending is just the start of something new. We'll meet again in another tale in another time. Don't forget to subscribe.